Panel, Lanice, you have it.
All right, thank you, Bob. We are still getting questions coming in from Twitter. I asked the last question from one of our social media platforms, so now I want to take some of the questions that we got from people who came out here tonight. And one of those questions for the candidates is this: what is your stance on gun control and gun-free areas?
Mr. Dunn.
Well, you can't claim to be a Second Amendment supporter and then bend in different directions. I'm fully support the Second Amendment. I think the pistol permit fee is an unfair tax on law-abiding citizens, and if law-abiding citizens, I would like them to be armed. I feel we're safer out here if our law-abiding citizens are armed, no matter where they're at. If you look around, if you think about a pawn shop, for an example, when's the last time you heard of a pawn shop being robbed? They don't get robbed because their owners there are all armed. And you think about that. How much safer would we be if all the bank tellers were armed? You think we'd have a lot of bank robberies? That's the way I look at it. I think the more law-abiding citizens are armed, the better off we will be.
Sheriff Mack.
I'm a full supporter of the Second Amendment. I believe that people should have a right to keep and bear arms in their homes, on their persons. In fact, we even have an individual here tonight that's carrying a gun on his side because Alabama is an open carry state. However, there have been certain restrictions that have been placed both by the state government as it relates to concealed carry, of handguns. And the sheriff is the primary enforcer of that because the sheriff does issue the pistol permits. I'm a lifelong member of the NRA. I believe that people should have the right to keep and bear arms, as I said. However, as sheriff of the county, I think the question was actually about gun-free zones. One of the things that the law specifically addressed this past year out of the legislature was allowing people, such as school boards, such as private businesses, to regulate whether or not firearms could be carried onto these places. Our schools are sanctuaries of safety for our children. A business owner should have the right to say whether or not someone can carry a gun on their premises if they own that business and they're working in that business.
Thank you, Sheriff. Mr. Milstead.
My job as the sheriff or a law enforcement officer is to enforce the law and not make the law. As it relates to gun-free zones, and it is true that, and I believe in the rights of private property ownership, you should have the right to regulate whether or not you want people to carry firearms on your premises. I am for every law-abiding citizen to own the weapon that they choose. I understand there's a policy within the sheriff's office to not sign off on Class 3 applications for things like suppressors or fully automatic weapons. And I do not, as chief deputy and when I was with Sheriff Johnson, we signed for those things, and I believe that you have a constitutional right to own that if you go through the requirements of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms application process. I am as pro-gun as we can possibly be. I am against convicted felons possessing guns and killing children like they killed the young lady on the island over there, and no charges were filed against them.
Mr. Milstead, thank you very much. Time. Brendan Kirby.
Thanks, Bob. To each of you, what would you say is the biggest mistake you've made during your law enforcement career, and how did you learn from it?
Sheriff Mack.
Lord. Brandon, you want to give me a hint? I would say that sometimes I become impatient, particularly because I have a desire to try to bring things to a resolution. I look back at a 28-year career in law enforcement, and one of the things that I've tried to particularly teach investigators is to slow down sometimes and really look into an investigation and take your time and document and things of that nature. So I think I cannot come up with one particular incident. I think there have been times collectively that I look back because I'm my world's worst critic. I constantly look back and try to evaluate decisions I have made and things I have done. And so I think a lot of times it just kind of goes back to being able to be slowed down, be patient with certain things, but yet still be persistent to accomplish the objective.
Mr. Milstead.
Having been in management most of my adult life, I think as far as mistakes made or maybe major mistake is really not learning people as well as I should in their personalities and whether or not I should have put as much trust in them as I did, and I paid the price for it. As far as it relates to pure law enforcement, I did arrest an individual back in the 90s that had been accused of a serial rapist based on some information I got from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, and I wound up staying in federal court over that because it turned out to be the wrong individual. And I paid the price for that. I was ultimately dismissed from the case. But I guess maybe being too trusting when sometimes I should have been suspect of some individuals and the information they were providing me, and I'm talking about law enforcement officers. As I told you, I taught in the police academy for 17 years, and you learn not everybody is in this for the right reason.
Mr. Milstead, thank you very much. Mr. Dunn.
And that's, the question was the biggest mistake?
Yes.
Well, I guess looking back on a long career and thinking about things that I did back in my younger days in patrol, the one thing I look back on that I regret the most is we were working these traffic grants, federal grants to work traffic, and it was a numbers thing where you had to get so many contacts per hour to keep this grant. I regret participating in those things because it was a numbers game, and it changed up what I believe changed the face of the department. And participating in roadblock checkpoints, it was like hunting over a baited field back in our younger days. And now I look back as it being an infringement on our rights. Maybe case law that backs it up and what you can do, but I still feel like now it was an infringement, and that would be my biggest regret.
All right, thank you very much. Cliff McCollum now. Next question.
Thank you, Bob. At a recent Baldwin County Commission meeting, the Juvenile Justice Program was recognized as an underfunded necessity for the department. Currently, some juvenile justice officials have to meet deputies at gas stations and Walmart parking lots across the county at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning in order to process and meet these juveniles face to face. How would you address this issue, specifically working to find the funding to adequately fund this department?
Mr. Milstead.
Well, first of all, the Juvenile Detention Center actually works for the county commission and not the office of sheriff. And it's really not the responsibility of the office of sheriff to seek funding for that detention center, okay? Now, we fully support the Juvenile Detention Center. We try to transport the juveniles as conveniently as possible to the closest juvenile probation officer, because you've got to make contact with them when you arrest a juvenile. But going to the crux of your question, it is not the responsibility of the sheriff to seek funding for the Juvenile Detention Center. It's up to the Baldwin County Commission. And Baldwin County is exploding in growth with more and more people moving over here. There's more and more juvenile crime, and it is going to have to be addressed. But I do not believe it is the responsibility of the sheriff.
Mr. Dunn.
Well, in the days when I was in patrol, it was when you handled a juvenile just like you would an adult. And now there's laws changed. We don't do that anymore. It took the, it's made it complicated. For a patrol deputy out there who comes across a juvenile committing a crime, at one time we could just arrest them, take them to the Juvenile Detention Center. You signed papers on them and you left them there. Then the Juvenile Detention Center either released them back to their parents or they were held until a court date. I don't know what happened with that system. The law changed on it, but that's the system we should get back to, because our kids are not going to learn anything if we just have to meet out in the parking lot and turn them right back over. They can go back out and commit the same crime again. So that's what we need to look at.
All right, Mr. Dunn. Sheriff Mack.
This is one I feel real good talking about because problem solved. As Mr. Milstead said, it's not the responsibility of the sheriff to seek funding for another entity. However, our deputies were literally having to meet the intake officers for the face-to-face interview that is required by the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act that was adopted several years ago, and doing these intakes in parking lots and all over the county, and it was tying deputies up. So the vested interest was for the sheriff's office to cooperate with the county commission and the juvenile judge, Carmen Bosch, and the juvenile authorities. We came together and we put our heads together in a cooperative spirit, and we solved the problem. Currently, the funding has been allocated by the Baldwin County Commission to fund the additional intake officers so that we will have intake officers now at Juvenile Detention Center 24/7, and we can now pick that juvenile up and, as Jeff said, take them back to the juvenile center and not tying our deputies up waiting to meet with an intake officer, which keeps the deputy on the road answering the calls and patrolling the areas.
All right,
that was
you.
our vested interest in this.
Thank you, Sheriff. Lanice, you have another question for us.
That's right, Bob, and this question actually comes from our Facebook page at Fox 10 News. This question is from Yodi, who asks, Mobile County Sheriff Sam Cochran has initiated several community-based efforts to get the community's involvement in what's going on in their neighborhood, like the Tex Meth, Tex Thug, and Tex Spice initiatives. They seem to be working quite well. Why can't we get this in Baldwin County?
Mr. Dunn.
Well, that's a good question. Why can't we get it done? I believe we can. And that gets back to bringing law enforcement in our community back together. And that's one way where this reserve program can work for that. We'll get more of our community involved with volunteers and get everybody on the same page of music. And that's it's a very good thing. That tip line really does work.
Sheriff Mack.
We have. We've worked very well with Sheriff Cochran. He has a staff of computer programmers that we have been working with, but the Sheriff's Office, in my tenure as Sheriff, has established a Twitter, Facebook page. We remodified our web page so that now we have report crime, that you can actually report nonviolent and non-urgent crime over our web page. We have My Baldwin section on the website where you can now actually go in and look at the crime mapping system. This is also linked to Sheriff Cochran's system over in Mobile County, because Sheriff Cochran and I have really formed a great working relationship. We share information back and forth. We do cooperate with his tip lines that they have there, and we're sharing information. And what Sheriff Cochran and I have found is, rather than each of us running our own individual entities, we have chosen to work together, because crime doesn't stop at Mobile Bay. Crime comes from Mobile into Baldwin, and sometimes from Baldwin into Mobile. And so we work very aggressively in partnering with those programs, and we do have these instances in place.
Thank you, Mr. Sheriff. Mr. Milstead.
Well, Sheriff Cochran had the vision many years ago to hire a guy by the name of Joe Bettner, who retired from the United States Customs Service, who is a wealth of information on dealing with the drug situation. And he set up this text program for people purchasing Sudafed, people distributing marijuana, meth, you name it. And while it is nice to have computer programs, everybody is walking around with a cell phone for all practical purposes on their sides these days, and the kids can do it with one hand without even looking at it, and it's instant texting. This is not what I'm hearing, again, out there in the incorporated areas of this county. There is not a system set up to respond to people's complaints about somebody that's dealing marijuana, somebody that's dealing spice, somebody that's got a meth lab going, or you smell a meth lab. This is not what I'm hearing, and I'm talking to people that are out there in the real world. As sheriff, I will have somebody like a Joe Bettner that would be there to set these programs up, and a good texting program to where we can respond to these, and that will be part of our drug task force.
Mr. Milstead, thank you very much. Next question from Lori DuBose.
Thank you, Bob. You've touched on, some of you have touched on this, but we can expand. Baldwin County is the fastest growing county in the state. What are your plans to expand the department to accommodate the growth?
Sheriff Mack.
As the sheriff of Baldwin County, I've been very much involved in this whole aspect of growth. One of the responsibilities I think that I have as your sheriff is to be plugged in, if you will, to the community. That's why I'm a member of every Chamber of Commerce. That's why I attend all civic club meetings, church meetings, and things of that nature, to stay attuned to this growth that's not coming. Ladies and gentlemen, it's here, and we're growing as we sit right now. What we have done is we have laid out a strategic plan where we will work with the county commission to grow the department in numbers of personnel. We want to decrease patrol areas. We always strive to decrease response times. We build those positive relationships. We have a plan in place that we will follow in partnership with the commission to address these issues of growth, because Baldwin County will continue to grow, and your sheriff's office needs to be responsive to those needs. And I think that we have the vision to carry this sheriff's office down the road for the next 10 years to address those issues.
Thank you. Mr. Milstead.
Well, being a member of every Chamber of Commerce in Baldwin County is a nice thing. And where are chambers of commerce located? They're located in the municipalities who also have police departments, all right? But if you live in Little River, Seminole, Rabun, Perdido, Stockton, those response times are incredibly lengthy. And I'm telling you, I go to Little River, and that's taxpayers up there as well, and it may take an hour or 2 hours for a deputy to get up there or not respond at all or just answer by a phone call. And it is not being in contact with the unincorporated areas of the county to be involved with the Chamber of Commerce. You've got to be out there in these community centers, the volunteer fire departments, and other gatherings within these communities to learn about what's going on in the prime area that you're supposed to be providing law enforcement protection to as sheriff.
Mr. Dunn.
Well, I agree partly with what Mr. Milstead said. The sheriff should be out in the rural areas talking to the people. You know, it's the way it was when I started. The sheriff was out and he communicated with people. The deputies did the same thing. It's about leadership. If the sheriff is out there talking to them, so will the deputies. And to cut down on the response time, there again, I'll go back to this reserve program. You wouldn't have to have backup coming from another area if we had a reserve deputy riding with the full-time officer. And I think that could be utilized. You got your backup there with you, so that would save time and gas and wear and tear on the other vehicles having to leave their area unattended and coming to back them up. So I think we have to take advantage of our volunteer program.
All right, thank you. Next question is from